Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, we welcome back Shealeigh Voitl. She's Project Censored's digital and print editor, a regular contributor, of course, to the project's annual book series. Voitl's writing has been featured, of course, in the annual book, State of the Free Press, most recently 2023. Just finished a round of doing research, writing, and copy editing with us at Project Censored for our next book. But Shealeigh has also been published by Truth Out, The Progressive, and Ms. Magazine. So we are joined today by Shealeigh Voitl to talk about several pieces of very timely topics that she's been publishing just the past few months. We haven't had time to catch up. We've been busy both at the project, and of course, Shealeigh's been extremely busy working with us, but we wanted to share three of these pieces with you today in our first segment. And you can find all of these pieces online for free, no paywall. And these are all issues, I think, near and dear to the project's audience. And in reverse order, we'll end by talking about what's realistic, what's disturbing, how entertainment trade magazines spin the WGA SAG-AFTRA strikes. A lot going on with that. We're going to get to that in a little while. Before that, we'll talk about the Earn It Act and how it ignores privacy and censorship concerns. Shealeigh wrote that with Avram Anderson, another longtime project contributor. Also, we're going to talk about a piece that Shealeigh did for the Progressive magazine that actually stems from a very long, in-depth investigative study started last summer, and Shealeigh Voitl is going to talk about that. But the Progressive magazine published this, How Corporate News Distorts Gun Violence. That's unfortunately timely because there is so much of this kind of violence in our culture. And of course, we're going to find out more specifically in the study, and this is where we'll begin with Shealeigh. In Chicago, as elsewhere, corporate media outlets regularly omit stories of people living in close proximity to gun violence. In other words, Shealeigh's going to talk to us about some of these distortions. But when we get into it here, let's actually go back to the roots of that study. But first, Shealeigh Voitl, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
Hi, Mickey. How you doing?
I'm great. It's I'm so glad that we were able to finally catch up with you. You've been really busy on so many different projects in these several pieces, but this is this piece that you did is it's the culmination of a study you started with interns at Project Censored, and you carried it through, and it took some time to conduct. So why don't we just start with the process? You're beginning this this research project some time ago, and let's just talk a little bit about that, the timeline and analysis, and then kind of give an overview of that study, and then we'll get into some details. Shealeigh Voitl.
Yeah, so my research partner, Sam Peacock, and I, who was a Project Censored intern at the time, we organized our searches to sort of capture the weeks leading up to the mass shootings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas in May 2022, and the weeks after. So we set it from April 14th, 2022 to June 24th, 2022. And we looked specifically at corporate and independent coverage of community level gun violence. So between non-intimately related individuals and cities, and compared that to coverage of mass violence. And we recorded over 1,700 quotations across 7 sources, which included Chicago Tribune, New York Times, Block Club Chicago, The City, a few Canadian sources as well, the Globe and Mail, Rabble. And we categorized them by type, source, and so on. And we found a lot of things that we were expecting, some things that we weren't expecting. The Progressive piece focuses in on Chicago specifically, which is where I'm from. So it is unfortunately an evergreen topic, but it was a long study, and we were interested, I guess, to see the results, but not surprised.
Well, why don't we just jump right into that? Let's jump into the results. And again, the way in which media report about violence or violent crime has long been at issue. I remember going back over 20 years, Michael Moore's film Bowling for Columbine calling attention to that mass school shooting, right? And I mean, that seems like so long ago. And unfortunately, school shootings have become just so much more commonplace. And I think just the nature of your study is the product of a society that's just gotten more and more potentially violent with these kinds of outbursts. And the way that it's covered is important, because the reason I'm alluding to that is going back to Barry Glassner, the sociologist from UCLA. He had a book called The Culture of Fear that was used in that film that talked about how violent crime was decreasing, but media coverage of it was wildly increasing. But it wasn't just increasing by some 300%. It was the type of coverage, the very sensationalistic coverage. And, going back and looking at that, a lot of details are left out. I think it's more grabbing eyeballs and scaring people, right? The culture of fear. And I'm just curious as to what you maybe discovered in the way in which media covers this gun violence. And I think one of the parts of your thesis is the fact that the corporate media, the so-called, quote, mainstream media, we don't use that phrase really here, it's establishment press or corporate media, they're distorting this issue here as well in 2022, 2023. This is an ongoing issue. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the findings and talk about what you mean about the distortion, in that kind of coverage, and what you hope people take from this kind of study.
Yeah. So, the articles about community level gun violence from the establishment press, which, as I mentioned before, in this case included Chicago Tribune, New York Times, overwhelmingly favored sources with official bureaucratic statuses, such as police officers, local government officials, who said a lot of the same thing every time. But if you looked at outlets like Block Club Chicago and The City, which is a New York City independent outlet, you saw diversity and perspective, not just in reports of a singular shooting in a given place, but in what the city is and isn't doing to prevent gun violence. These articles more often included quotes from local activists, community members, religious leaders. So it's more about the quality of reporting that we just weren't seeing when it came to community level gun violence that we were with mass shooting. After a mass shooting event, corporate coverage provided, in-depth discussion of gun legislation, how these events shaped the conversation surrounding gun safety and gun violence prevention. The articles talk about the victims, the survivors, their family members. Articles about community level gun violence were much narrower in scope, and some of this can be explained by a lack of resources at these papers, but many relied mostly on police accounts. Shootings in Chicago's downtown area, however, received more in-depth coverage. This was a trend we saw in New York coverage as well. Coverage of community violence was comprehensive when it came to violence in the city center. For example, like while downtown shootings spiked last year, gun violence in areas like the Loop and River North in Chicago, which are predominantly white, still accounts for a small percentage of the city's overall gun violence, yet it made up 15% of the Chicago Tribune's reporting in our timeline. Shootings in predominantly Black neighborhoods in Chicago's South and West Sides accounted for less than 10% of the Tribune's reporting, despite constituting a substantial portion of the city's gun violence. And this framing paints this type of violence as random, when community gun violence reflects inequities of systemic racism, such as redlining, mass incarceration. So how can you begin to imagine solutions to something that you're taught to believe is totally random? We know sort of what the conversation is when it comes to mass shooting event. There's a conversation around gun legislation, but really for community level gun violence, a start would be to fund core community institutions, invest in affordable housing, jobs, healthcare, education. Chicago launched Our City, Our Safety in 2020 to do that in 15 neighborhoods across Chicago with higher rates of gun violence. But while Chicago Tribune was focused on how violence downtown would affect tourism and tax revenue, they missed the fact that West Pullman, one of the neighborhoods the plan was supposed to support, saw none of the promised funds by July 2021, but it had experienced a drastic spike in gun violence. So I think the takeaway from all of this is the quality of reporting that mass violence may get after a horrible tragedy, such as what happened in Buffalo, such as what happened in Uvalde. These shootings in communities across the country do not get, and therefore are not visible, and therefore do not get the access to preventative action that may exist for other communities.
So we're hearing in the establishment press an overt reliance on establishment kind of sources, sensationalist coverage that doesn't really get to roots, coverage that appears that it's random and unstoppable, or you get the pablum of the red versus blue. You get the red says we need more guns, the blue says we need to restrict guns, and then everybody goes out and does that again until the next shooting. It seems like the rinse and repeat cycle of tragedy, and the way that the reporting, the way that the establishment reporting on that is that it almost seems to fuel that cycle, and it's a loop. It seems like a feedback loop that they can't seem to get out of. And you clearly show that when the independent press, or when there's a different lens and a different frame and a different constituency involved, you're saying that the study clearly illustrates that that kind of reporting is very different. And one would hope, extrapolating from that maybe that kind of reporting spurs civic engagement or spurs some other kind of thinking where people feel empowered to not just be victims of these kinds of crimes, but maybe actually do something meaningful to address it where they are happening. Shealeigh Voitl.
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening, and I think that's the part that's so frustrating is you see certain discussions around gun legislation that just aren't happening with the other types of solutions that exist for community gun violence. So gun legislation, while important, isn't the only way forward, but it is the one that gets the most attention. So for example, violence interruption programs resulted in a nearly 60% reduction in gun violence on Chicago's West Side. And these programs, which often enlist the help of local paraprofessional health workers, help identify and mediate conflict. And in 2021, the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, pledged $50 million to these initiatives. And this is because of the work of community organizations like Centers for New Horizons and Institute for Nonviolence Chicago. I read about these organizations for the first time in Block Club Chicago. Coverage of these initiatives is crucial because funding is crucial. And in order for these programs to receive the funding that they need and deserve, they need to be visible. And that is where, media steps in, but is lacking currently.
Right. And Shealeigh Voitl, you talk in the study about gun violence as a public health issue, which actually this has gone on for maybe at least a decade, going back with studies and other administrations talking about gun violence as a public health problem and a public health issue. So you actually cover that and factor that into the study as well.
Yeah, so Illinois actually declared gun violence a public health crisis in 2021. But before that, independent outlets' coverage connected the dots. It conveyed the urgency that gun violence in our country demands, not just attention when a horrible mass shooting tragedy occurs, but consistently and evenly. Just because you're not seeing things being done about gun violence outside of like politicians arguing about it in our nation's capital doesn't mean that community members aren't doing the hard work already of keeping this conversation alive and protecting the people in their communities.
Absolutely. And again, I want to remind listeners that we are speaking with Shealeigh Voitl, Project Censored's editorial associate, a regular contributor to our annual book series, also an author of several pieces that we're going to talk about today, some posted freely at projectcensored.org, but also Shealeigh Voitl's been published in Ms. Magazine, also the Progressive Magazine. Part of this gun study that we were just discussing was published in the Progressive Magazine, How Corporate News Distorts Gun Violence. The full study, Not Shooting Straight, is available again for free at the projectcensored.org site. Shealeigh Voitl, we have several other things that we want to talk about, but as we leave this segment briefly, what do you hope people take away from your study of media coverage on this kind of gun violence?
Yeah, I mean, I hope they, I think, read outside of the corporate press when it comes to these issues. Look at your local media and see what they're doing, what they're talking about. For me, in Chicago, sources like Southside Weekly and Block Club Chicago understand the importance of including the perspectives of community members living in close proximity to gun violence, who also know all too well the negative effects of over-policing. So, I mean, this coverage really shapes the conversation around the change that we want to see, the change that we've been waiting for years and years for. But by ignoring that work that's being done by people in these communities, we're marginalizing them further.
That's Shealeigh Voitl, author of several pieces that we're talking about today on the program. We're going to take a quick break right now, a music break, but then we're going to come back and continue with Shealeigh Voitl. We're going to talk about the Earn It Act, a piece co-authored with Avram Anderson, about how the Earn It Act ignores privacy and censorship concerns. And we're going to wrap up today's segment with Shealeigh Voitl by talking about updates on the WGA SAG-AFTRA strikes in Hollywood among the writers, how entertainment trade magazines are spinning the kind of reporting that's going on there. Stay tuned. We'll continue after this brief musical break on the Project Censored Show. Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today, in this segment, we are honored to welcome Shealeigh Voitl. Shealeigh is author of several of the pieces that we're talking about today. In the first segment, we talked about gun violence, media coverage of mass shootings, and community violence. We are going to talk about two other pieces right now. And again, Shealeigh is the digital and print editor for Project Censored, and again has been published in Truth Out, The Progressive, Ms. Magazine, and more. This second piece that we're talking about today, Shealeigh Voitl, you wrote with Avram Anderson. It's about the Earn It Act. And so I want to back up for just a second so that you can remind people what exactly is the Earn It Act. I mean, I already mentioned that it ignores privacy and censorship concerns, and some people in the audience may be saying, I don't even know what it is. So help us out. Help us out. What is the Earn It Act?
Yeah, so it stands for the Eliminating Abusive and Rampant Neglect of Interactive Technologies Act. It's actually being reintroduced in Congress for the third time. And as you mentioned, it increases surveillance and censorship, dismantles end-to-end encryption, all under the guise of making the online world sort of safer for children. But I think, as we'll talk very shortly about, it won't do that. It won't do that. Academics, scholars agree. There's just no way that that this is headed for somewhere safe for anyone, including children.
Yeah, and again, I realize that, you know, when people hear that out loud, when people hear opposition to this, what sounds like it's a kind of a convoluted title, leave it to Congress to figure that out, right, with their acronyms. But I mean, when at the core of it, one might say, like, well, this sounds important. I mean, don't we want to protect, people in this kind of way? But as you write here, you say that the Earn It Act will create an unelected commission of representatives from law enforcement, victim services, and technology companies tasked with developing best practices of, quote, preventing, identifying, disrupting, and reporting online child sexual exploitation. So clearly an important topic, something we absolutely want to prevent, identify, disrupt, and report: child sexual exploitation.
Absolutely.
However, yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, you write, unfortunately, the commission will not include anyone from civil liberties groups who have voiced concerns about the legislation's impact So let's talk about what the concerns are. I mean, you just said, like, of course we're concerned about children being exploited in this way. That should go without saying. But what are the actual legitimate concerns? And I know you're going to talk to us about something called Section 213. So Shealeigh Voitl, please explain.
Yeah, so EARN-IT does undermine Section 230, which means that the interactive community computer services can be held responsible for illegal user-generated content. And what that means further is that these services sort of run the risk of like overcorrecting and censoring perfectly legal user speech all over the internet to avoid the possibility of litigation. The EARN-IT authors, which include like Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Richard Blumenthal, have repeatedly ignored media scholars that say this will not help survivors of online child sexual exploitation, but rather might leave them with less recourse than before, because more recently, the concern is that if these services are acting as agents of the government by conducting warrantless searches, then any evidence of a crime that's collected could be rendered inadmissible later on.
Yeah, and I mean, again, you mentioned that these kinds of rules, laws, these bills that are proposed weaken or drop encryption for legally protected content. We see that with FOSTA and SESTA. You also talk about something KOSA, Kids Online Safety Act. You also go on to write that there's sort of a moral panic around the impact of social media. And you write 43 states have introduced over 140 pieces of legislation in 2023 that deal with children's online rights and privacy. But again, your concern, the concern of Avram Anderson and other media scholars, civil libertarians, is that there's overreach here that actually ends up impacting perfectly legal content. Shealeigh Voitl.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, it's very concerning, and it should be concerning for everyone, but I think especially vulnerable groups, because of EARN-IT's move to dismantle end-to-end encryption. The bill sort of poses these tremendous data privacy concerns for vulnerable groups such as LGBTQ community, particularly LGBTQ youth that use these platforms to explore their identity, seek gender affirming care. It also puts people seeking abortions in certain places at risk, immigrants, journalists, other people.
Which is an issue now, right?
Absolutely. And it's scary. I mean, it's really, really scary because this bill is so broad and where does it end? You know, if something like this gets passed, you know, what happens down the line? And there are other avenues to protect people online, protect children online from these horrible things that we're talking about within the EARN-IT Act. But censorship is not the way to do that.
No, and you write in your conclusion that the real world consequences of these kinds of bills will forever impact everyone's online access, privacy, and experience. So I think the argument here is that there are better ways to protect youth online, et cetera, without casting such a great dragnet that has such negative impact on civil rights and civil liberties.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, you co-authored Media and Me, as did Avram, which is, you know, comprehensive media literacy curricula. You know, it's like that could be, you know, very powerful, more rigorous data privacy standards for adolescents, supporting research on, you know, the mental health effects of social media. There's also legislation that protects kids without censoring speech, like the Invest in Child Safety Act. But yeah, I mean, EARN-IT just sets a dangerous precedent for freedom of expression without helping or protecting kids online.
It's particularly important, I think, that people dig beneath the headlines and dig beneath the clever names, because again, on the surface, you know, it can really get some people saying, well, that doesn't sound like a bad idea. But as usual, Shealeigh Voitl, you and Avram Anderson in this case really expose once again that the devil is often in the details.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Shealeigh Voitl, we have 5-6 minutes left in our segment here, and that's at least enough time to get started on what's turning out to be a long ongoing story now with the Hollywood writers strike, right? We have the WGA, SAG-AFTRA strikes. You wrote a piece not long ago called "What's Realistic, What's Disturbing," and of course that's riffing on a quote, and we're going to get into that a little bit with some of the things that Hollywood studio moguls have. Well, they've kind of been caught with foot in mouth disease. It looks like they've been saying a lot of things out loud that, I mean, are reminiscent of the robber baron era of the late 19th century in terms of how they're talking about labor, wealth generators. I mean, we all know these are human beings, right? Not just laborers, workers, and wealth generators. But by some of the language that we hear coming out of the trade magazines, the very pro-corporate studio publications, well, it's been pretty disconcerting. And I think you did a great job unpacking why labor rights are important, why intellectual work is labor. And look, the entertainment industry, as we're seeing, it just isn't going to run without the brains and the labor and the intellectual and artistic and creative work behind it. And these people are asking for a cut of their wealth. I mean, again, as I keep going back, I feel like it's like Eugene Debs and the Pullman strike. Is it like 1894? There's a lot of that overtones here. I mean, I'm an historian too, so I can't help but see some of those and connect some of those dots. But the Writers Guild of America, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, okay, they represent major Hollywood studios, Netflix, Amazon, Disney. They were negotiating this past summer. They came to an impasse, and of course, this actually came to a strike. Actually, this was in the spring, and the strike started in the spring, has continued over summer. So the strike is ongoing, and in fact, we're even just very recently seeing Drew Barrymore, Bill Maher, with scab-like behavior, as they were criticized for wanting to bring their shows back without the writers. And we see that that's actually backfired recently. But Shealeigh Voitl, take us down this path. What's been happening in this case, and what's specifically, what's at stake here? You're writing about disputes over pay, regulation of AI, a whole raft of things that people may not be thinking about. So Shealeigh Voitl, help unpack this for us.
Yeah, so the writer's strike started in May. And among other things, writers are just asking for compensation that fairly reflects the structure of streaming services, which now currently, the way that it's set up, offer very meager residuals for these writers of these shows. Right now, writers are grossly underpaid and are forced to just jump from job to job to job just to remain afloat. SAG actors joined the writers on the picket line in July, and they had similar concerns over pay, regulation of AI, being paid to use their likeness, and improved healthcare benefits. But I think the thing that was like most striking was, for me, I was on Twitter and I saw like these entertainment magazines like Deadline and Hollywood Reporter tweeting these things that almost seemed like they were spokespeople for Hollywood executives. And it's like, why is that the point? Shouldn't you be talking about the writers that these shows have been, the writers for these shows that have been exploited for a long time? Why are you like, what are they asking for? What are they being denied? Like, why are you making this about the viewers and what's, at stake for the viewers, when clearly what's more at stake is like livelihood for these workers?
Well, Shealeigh Voitl, one of the passages you captured here that's, again, a couple of quotes, not flattering quotes in my estimation of some of these studio moguls. One of them, published in Deadline in July, an executive said, quote, "The end game is to allow things to drag on until union members start losing their apartments and losing their houses." That's a pretty candid moment there.
Yeah, I mean, it's gross. And it just like it, and I mean, I talk about this in the article. Jenny Yang, who was a comedian and actor, writer, called it out right immediately. It's union busting. That's like what they just want. They want to scare these workers into ending the strike. And unfortunately, people like Drew Barrymore, people like Bill Maher, they obviously backed out of, continuing with their shows. But if they hadn't, crossing the picket line would have just normalized what these studio execs are doing, by denying just a cut of their multi-million dollars to these workers that are busting their butt trying to, make this amazing content for everyone. And yeah, I
People
mean,
that
there's
were
nothing
essential
normal
workers.
about it.
No, but
Yeah,
remember during the pandemic, these people were called essential workers because they kept people going, right? They kept people from worrying about some things. Maybe they got people distracted while they were dealing with the pandemic. I mean, we don't talk about that as being a good thing all the time when it comes to news, but in entertainment, I mean, people want some escape. They want that. And so these people were all respected. They were saying, oh my gosh, they're doing great. What ends up happening is the industry itself was billions of dollars, right? Raking in all kinds of record profits, bragging about it. And then people like Disney CEO Bob Iger, you wrote this. You wrote that he told CNBC that the writers and actors' expectations were not, quote, realistic. And he finds the strike, quote, disturbing. But you pointed out, this is coming from someone who makes 535 times what a Disney employee's median pay is. And most of these people on strike aren't they're not the Drew Barrymores or the Bill Maher's. They're the people you never heard of that don't even make a living wage in a place like California. And they're asking for a cut of the multi-billion dollars worth of profits. And that's what doesn't get reported.
Yeah. And I mean, when you see coverage now of Drew Barrymore, first announcing that she would proceed with the filming of the show, backing out, you see that, and that's at the forefront of your mind. And what it does slowly is it, delegitimizes the workers' concerns and demands, and they're valid. This is like a brand new system of streaming, and they're asking is for a pay structure that reflects changing times.
And protection from technologies, new technologies like AI that could take away their entire jobs, could take their whole jobs.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's not like what Bob Iger is saying, it's unrealistic, it's disturbing, but it's not. And they want you to read those quotes and think that these workers are just asking for too much, that they're being greedy, and that is not the case. That's not the case. And so it's really important to follow the strike as it goes on, and not take these, studio execs, these celebrities that are maybe, moving in ways that are not in line with the strike. It's important to listen to the people that are on the front lines, that are on the picket lines, that understand what they want, what they need, what they deserve. Because I love TV, I love movies. I want my favorite shows to come back, but I want to know that these things are being made by people that are getting paid fairly for their work. And as you mentioned, being protected.
Well, again, and I happen to know that you also have a background in the arts and in music. It's something that you do, and you have I honestly think that people that do that may have a deeper appreciation for what it means to be a professional in the creative arts. I'm also a former professional musician of several decades, and it's a lot of work. It's hard work, and good artists make it look fun or sound fun. And again, oftentimes the people that make it happen are people that you never get to see, that Bob Iger is saying, well, you're unrealistic. And, really what's unrealistic is the fact that we have these multimillionaires and billionaires. And if, as you finish the article, that's in fact what's more disturbing coming out of a place that we call Tinseltown, right? That's far more disturbing. So really great points in the article. And again, still timely. That's something that is still with us. You can see that piece, what's realistic, what's disturbing, how entertainment trade magazines spin the WGA SAG-AFTRA strikes, as a dispatch for free at projectcensored.org. Our guest for this segment today has been Project Censored digital and print editor Shealeigh Voitl. She penned that piece, also penned a piece called Earn It Still Ignores Privacy and Censorship Concerns about the Earn It Act with Avram Anderson. And we started the program talking about a long-term gun study and media coverage that Shealeigh Voitl did. Not shooting straight. Corporate media gives mass shootings blanket coverage while missing community-level gun violence. Shealeigh Voitl, thank you so much for being with us today on the Project Censored Show to share your research and your writing. People can learn more about Shealeigh at projectcensored.org, or you can see more of her writings at places like Ms. Magazine, Truth Out, and The Progressive. Shealeigh Voitl, thanks so much for joining the program.
Thanks for having me, Mickey.